My grandmother was the most terrifying woman in the north of England, and she knew it, and she used it the way a general uses artillery. I know because I was standing in the doorway of Dunvaren Hall on the morning she launched her campaign, and I had the distinct misfortune of understanding exactly what she was doing, while my brother remained entirely oblivious. His name was Callum, the Duke of Dunvaren, and he was at that time 34 years old, master of 14,000 acres, and the most stubbornly unmovable man I had ever encountered in my life. He had refused every match the county had produced for 3 consecutive seasons. He had sat through 50 dinner parties, a dozen country house visits, and one particularly excruciating weekend at Hartwell Park where Lady Ashborough had sent her 3 daughters at him simultaneously, and he had emerged from each occasion not only unattached, but I suspected faintly amused. Women in drawing rooms made him polite. Women in gardens made him courteous. Women at pianofortes made him briefly attentive. None of them made him anything else. My grandmother had watched all of this with the patient, measuring expression of a woman who has decided the problem is solvable and is merely waiting for the correct instrument to present itself. The instrument, as it turned out, had been living in her house for 2 years. I should explain. Our grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Dunvaren, Lady Elspeth, 72 years old and still requiring smelling salts only when it suited her, had taken on a companion some years prior. The young woman's father had been a scholar, a man of considerable learning and negligible income, a distant connection of our family who had died leaving behind a modest library, a great many debts, and a daughter named Rosalind. Rosalind was not what anyone in our circle would have called a remarkable girl. She was quiet where our grandmother's acquaintances were brilliant. She was plainly dressed where the heiresses of the county were magnificently turned out. She had a steady, thoughtful face, brown hair that she wore without particular artistry, and eyes of a gray-green that noticed everything and commented on very little. She read to my grandmother in the evenings. She managed correspondence in the mornings. She occasionally played the harpsichord with more competence than flair. And she moved through Dunvaren Hall with the practiced invisibility of someone who has learned that the quietest person in the room is seldom interrupted, and therefore always thinking. I had noticed her, of course. I am not my brother. But Callum, and this is the heart of it, had not noticed her at all. Or so I thought. The letter arrived in the 2nd week of October, and I happened to be visiting when my grandmother read it aloud at breakfast with the serene authority of a woman pronouncing a verdict. I have invited, she said, unfolding the page, the following young women to a fortnight's house party at Dunvaren Hall. They will arrive the 1st of November. You will be here, Callum. This was not a question. It was issued in the tone she reserved for declarations of weather. My brother looked up from his eggs. A house party. Yes. How many? 8. He set down his fork with the careful precision of a man choosing his battles. Grandmother. They are all entirely suitable, she said. The Ashborough girls, not all 3, I'm not a fool, just the eldest, Harriet. Miss Pemberton of Beckford, the Lorraine cousins from Wiltshire, Lady Morcliffe's niece, and 3 others whose names I shall furnish you when you have finished looking as though I have asked you to wrestle a bear. I don't need. The dukedom needs an heir, Callum. The north needs a duchess. And I, she said, folding the letter with a crisp, final snap, need to know the line continues before I am in no position to care. She looked at him steadily. I am 72 years old, indulge me. He could not in good conscience argue with 72. He said, 1 fortnight, I make no promises. I require none, she said, and she smiled. I watched that smile. I had seen it before. It was the smile of a woman who has already won. I stayed because I had learned early in life that when my grandmother orchestrated something, watching it was worth any inconvenience. The guests arrived on the 1st of November, and Dunvaren Hall, which in October had been a place of quiet fires and wool-draped furniture, and my grandmother's harpsichord played by Rosalind on Tuesday evenings, was suddenly full of silk and perfume, and the particular high-pitched vivacity of 8 young women who had each been privately informed that a duke was available. Callum received them at the door with impeccable courtesy, and, I noted, no discernible warmth. Harriet Ashborough was beautiful and knew it, and spoke to him as though she were doing him a favor. Miss Pemberton was clever and said so, frequently. The Lorraine cousins were energetic and took over the morning room. Lady Morcliffe's niece, a sweet, nervous creature, spilled her tea on the first evening and spent the rest of the dinner apologizing for it. The other three were various arrangements of accomplished, pleasant, and entirely aware that they were being evaluated. Callum was courteous to all of them. He was, in fact, exactly as courteous to each of them as he was to the footmen, which told me everything. Rosalind, meanwhile, had been quietly repositioned. I noticed it on the second day. She was no longer eating breakfast in the small room off the kitchen, where she usually took her meals when the house was full. She was at the breakfast table, seated at my grandmother's right hand, with the air of someone who has been placed there by a force considerably greater than her own preferences, and has decided not to make a scene about it. She was reading something, a small volume, which she closed neatly when conversation required, and she ate with the economical, unself-conscious appetite of a person who is thinking about something more interesting than the food. Callum arrived late to breakfast, took his seat at the head of the table, surveyed the assembled company, and began to serve himself from the sideboard. He passed behind Rosalind's chair. He paused. Not a dramatic pause, not a stagey one. Just the fraction of a second in which a man registers something unexpected and then continues, because he is a duke, and dukes do not stop in the middle of serving themselves eggs to stare at their grandmother's companion. But I saw it, and my grandmother, I was certain, had arranged the seating precisely so that she would see it. "Miss Rosalind," he said, with the sort of careful neutrality that told me he was thinking about his phrasing, "I wasn't aware you were joining us for the fortnight's party." "I wasn't aware I was to," she said pleasantly, "until your grandmother informed me this morning." My grandmother was serenely occupied with her toast. "And do you find it agreeable?" He was already moving on, already reaching for the salt, and the question had the slightly abstracted quality of a man asking not because he requires an answer, but because something about the situation requires him to say more than he has said. She looked up from her teacup. "I find it a great deal livelier than Tuesdays," she said, "which is a recommendation in its way." Callum looked at her. A full, considering look, the kind he rarely gave anyone. Then something at the corner of his mouth moved, almost invisibly, in a direction that was not quite a smile, but was near enough to one that I set down my cup and made a mental note. "Yes," he said. "I suppose it is." And he went back to his seat, and the party continued, and nothing outwardly changed. Except that over the following 4 days, I noticed with increasing fascination that wherever Rosalind happened to be in any given room, my grandmother had arranged things so that Callum was within reasonable proximity. It was done with the subtlety of a master. At the afternoon readings by the fire, Rosalind was invariably in the wing chair near the window, which happened to be the chair Callum chose, when he stayed for the first quarter of an hour before declaring he had correspondence to see to. At evening dinners, she was placed neither too close nor too far, close enough for conversation to extend naturally, far enough to require an effort. During the walk in the south garden on the third day, when the frost had lifted, and the ladies wrapped themselves in cloaks and promenaded the paths, Rosalind was at the rear of the party, studying the remains of the late autumn garden with the focused attention of someone who has genuinely thought about plants, and Callum, who had been walking with Harriet Ashborough at the front, found some reason to drop back. I did not hear what they said. I was deliberately not close enough to hear. But I saw the angle of his head, the slight forward lean that meant he was listening, the way Rosalind gestured briefly toward the rose arch with her gloved hand as she made some observation, and the way he looked at what she was pointing at and then looked back at her, with an expression I had not seen on my brother's face in a very long time. He was interested. Not politely interested, the way one is interested in a piece of music one has not heard before. Genuinely interested. The way a man is interested when he has just realized that the conversation he is in is the most real conversation he has had in weeks. My grandmother, I later discovered, had told Rosalind about the garden restoration project, had specifically asked her to review the account books relating to the Rose Terrace and to form an opinion, had, in other words, armed her with the precise subject that Callum had been meaning to address for 2 years and had not found anyone interested enough to discuss. I confronted my grandmother about this on the 4th evening, when the ladies had retired and Callum was in his study, and it was just the 2 of us and the fire. "You planned this," I said, "all of it down to the Rose Terrace." She did not look up from her embroidery. I don't know what you mean. You invited 8 perfectly good heiresses to give Callum the impression he was choosing from a field, but you never intended him to look at any of them. You intended him to look at Rosalind. She made a small, precise stitch. Rosalind has been under this roof for 2 years, she said. He has had 2 years to look. He didn't know to look. No, she said. He didn't. That is what I am correcting. She finally glanced up, and her eyes were clear and steady and entirely unrepentant. She is the finest person in this house. She has been the finest person in this house since the day she arrived. She reads, she thinks, she listens, she keeps her own counsel, and she cares for me without making me feel like a responsibility. If Callum requires 8 London heiresses as a backdrop before he sees what is directly in front of him, then I shall provide him 8 London heiresses. It is a small inconvenience for everyone concerned. I sat with this for a moment. And if he still doesn't see? She smiled. He already does, she said. He simply hasn't admitted it yet. She was right, but the manner in which it happened was not, I think, even my grandmother's precise design. Some things even the most brilliant architects of schemes cannot perfectly engineer. Some things simply occur. It happened on the 7th day. A courier had arrived from the east with papers relating to the Dunvaren estate tenancies, a dispute that had been simmering for months over a boundary wall, and a contested deed that no one could satisfactorily read. The original document, handwritten in a secretary hand from some 60 years prior, had baffled 3 separate solicitors. Callum had brought it back to the house in a state of controlled exasperation. He sat with it in the library for an hour. Then he sent for his secretary, who was in the village. The secretary had gone to Harrogate for the week. He sat with it for another hour. Rosalind knocked on the library door because she was bringing the afternoon post for my grandmother, and the library was on the way. She knocked and he said, "Come," without looking up, and she came in, set the tray of letters on the corner of the sideboard, and was turning to leave when she paused. I did not see this happen. Callum told me afterward, on the evening before the guests departed, when we sat together in the library, and he was in the particular mood of a man who needs to say a thing aloud in order to be sure it is true. She paused, he said, and she looked at the document on the desk, and she said, "Is that the Meldern boundary deed?" And I said, yes, how did she know? And she said because our grandmother had mentioned it last winter, and also because she had spent a month last summer going through the estate account books and had encountered several references to the dispute. And then she said, "The 60s hand is difficult, but it's not unreadable, may I?" He stopped. "And you gave it to her?" I said. "I gave it to her and she read it." He looked at his hands, not haltingly, not slowly. She read it the way one reads a letter from a friend. She read the whole of it and then she set it down and she said, "The boundary is defined in the 3rd paragraph. They've been arguing about the measurement, but the reference point is the old stone cross, not the mill. The mill wasn't built until 1804. If you find a survey of the cross, the matter resolves itself." She said all of this in the same tone one uses to describe what one had for luncheon. And then she asked if she might carry the letters on. I said nothing, I waited. "I asked her to stay," he said. I didn't plan to. I asked her if she would sit for a moment because I wanted to understand how she had learned to read that hand. And she sat, and we talked for," he stopped. 2 hours. 2 hours. About the estate, about the tenant histories, about the survey records and the land enclosures and the history of the valley. He looked at me with an expression I recognized as the look of a man who has had the floor removed from beneath his feet and is still working out how to feel about it. "She knows this land, Alistair. She knows it better than I do. She has been reading about it for 2 years, apparently because she finds it interesting, and it has never occurred to her to mention it because no one has ever asked. I thought about Rosalind at the breakfast table with her small book. I thought about her in the garden with her gloved hand indicating the rose arch. I thought about 2 years of Tuesday evenings and morning correspondence and my grandmother's steady, patient, knowing smile. "She finds it interesting," I repeated. "She finds it interesting," he said. "And she asked me," he stopped again. He had the expression of a man recalling something he intends to keep. "She asked me a question about the eastern boundary that no one has asked in 30 years, and I didn't have the answer, and I was not embarrassed. I was," he looked for the word, "glad that someone had asked." I let the silence sit. Then I said, "Callum, Does grandmother know you spent 2 hours in the library with Rosalind today? He looked at me. I don't see why that, he stopped. He looked at the fire, a very long pause. She knows everything that happens in this house. Yes, I said. Another pause. She planned this. She planned this, I agreed. I watched the succession of things move across my brother's face. The recognition, the retrospection, the particular expression of a man reviewing the preceding week through an entirely different lens. The walk in the garden, the breakfast seating, the afternoon readings, the Rose Terrace conversation, 8 heiresses in silk arranged as a backdrop. And one young woman in a plain gray dress, placed at the right hand of a dowager duchess who had been watching her companion and her grandson for 2 years, and had simply decided enough was enough. Good God, he said quietly. Indeed, I said. He was quiet for a long time. The fire settled. From somewhere above us, through the old floors of Dunvaren Hall, came the faint sound of a harpsichord. One of the guests, or possibly Rosalind, who played on Tuesdays when there was no one to overhear. Callum lifted his head. That's not one of the guests, he said. No, I said, I don't think it is. He stood from his chair by the fire and moved to the window, looking out at the park, where the last of the evening light was going gray over the far trees. I watched him. He was very still, in the manner of a man who is not standing at a window because there is anything worth seeing through it, but because he needs to be upright and he needs to be facing away from someone while he sorts through what he is feeling. She said the same thing again this morning, he said finally without turning. After breakfast, Lady Morcliffe's niece said something about the garden being very fine, and Rosalind said, very quietly, to no one in particular, not to me, that the south terrace would need the box hedges cut back before spring or they'd lose the light to the old roses. And she was right. And I have been meaning to see to that for 3 years, and I had forgotten, and she said it as though she'd walked that garden 100 times and simply had the thought that needed saying. He was quiet. She says things like that. Things that are simply true and correct, and that she doesn't expect anyone to congratulate her for. I said nothing. I find it, he stopped. Then I find it very difficult not to hear it, when she speaks. He stood, he did it without particular deliberateness, the way a man stands when he has decided on something and there is no longer any reason to sit. He straightened his coat. He looked at me. Do you think she knows, he said, about grandmother's scheme? I considered this. I had been considering it for some days. Rosalind had the eyes of a woman who noticed everything and the manner of a woman who chose carefully what to do with what she noticed. My grandmother was brilliant, but Rosalind had been living in her house for 2 years. I think, I said, that she may know, and I think she chose to be in the library this afternoon with the letters for the post tray. She could have sent a footman. Callum was quiet. She chose to come herself, I said. He looked toward the door. Then he looked at me. There was something in his face I had not seen in a long time, something lighter than his usual composed authority, something that was almost, on my serious, still-faced brother, the expression of a man who is quietly frightened and quietly glad. I'm going to find her, he said. Yes, I said, I assumed you were. He found her in the music room, which was down the long passage from the library, and through the green baize door that divided the family wing from the older part of the house. The guests had retired or gathered in the drawing room. The music room was unlit except for 2 candles on the harpsichord stand, and Rosalind was playing from memory, something unhurried and exact and seemingly written for a room of 2 candles and a winter night. She stopped when she heard the door. She turned on the bench. In the candlelight, with her plain dress and her quietly arranged hair and her steady gray-green eyes, she looked like someone who had never particularly wanted to be found, but had, perhaps, been waiting for it. Callum told me, she said, is something wrong? And he said, no, nothing is wrong, I wanted to hear the rest. And she played the rest. He sat in the chair near the window, and she played the piece through to its end, and then the room was quiet. Then he said, my grandmother arranged this entire fortnight to put you in front of me. Rosalind looked at the keys. I know, she said. You know. She told me actually, she said. 2 weeks ago. She said she had invited a number of suitable young women, and she intended to invite me as well, and that the rest was up to me. Callum was silent. I almost declined, Rosalind said. I thought it was not a particularly dignified position to be in, being arranged like furniture in someone else's matrimonial scheme. She was quiet for a moment, but she said a thing that made me stay. She looked up at him. She said, "You have been the best possible version of invisible for 2 years. I am suggesting that you try being visible for a fortnight and see which suits you better." The candle nearest the bench had started to gutter. Callum reached across and steadied it, which brought him close enough that the distance between them was no longer the distance of a duke and a companion in a music room. It was the distance of two people who have both decided something and are simply waiting to say it. "And," he said, "which suits you better?" She held his gaze. The steadiness in it was not defiance. It was something rarer, a woman who knows her own worth and is neither anxious nor performing. "Ask me something specific," she said, "and I'll tell you." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Would you walk with me tomorrow, not in a party? Not with 8 other people, and my grandmother's strategically placed rose arches. Just with me." She was quiet in turn. "Yes," she said finally, "I would." I heard this second-hand, of course. Callum told me the essentials in the kind of stripped-down summary men use when they want to convey that something important has occurred without having to produce the exact words, because some words belong to the moment and not to the retelling. But I know what happened after. They walked the following morning, the two of them in the gray November light, along the eastern boundary path that runs beside the stone wall that was at the center of the disputed deed. I know this because I saw them from the upper gallery window, and because an hour later Rosalind came back inside with color in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the cold, and because Callum came back with a look on his face that I had not seen there since he was approximately 19 years old. I will tell you what I observed of that walk, because I watched from the upper gallery for a time, and because Callum is not the sort of man who describes things in detail, and someone ought to record what actually happened. They walked the eastern path at a pace that was neither hurrying nor dawdling, the kind of pace that belongs to two people who are comfortable with silence, and therefore not compelled to fill it. I saw Rosalind stop at the old stone cross that marked the survey point, the one she had identified from the document the previous afternoon, and crouch down to look at the inscription on its base. I saw Callum crouch beside her. They were both very close to the stone and very close to each other, and I could see from the angle of their heads that they were reading the inscription together, which is not the sort of thing that happens by accident. Later, much later, after it was all settled, Rosalind told me that he had asked her, at the stone cross, whether she had always been drawn to history or whether it was the particular history of this place. She had said that it was both, and that there was something about a place that had been the same for 300 years that she found steadying. She had said this without affectation or apology, the way one states a fact one has not been asked to defend. And Callum had looked at the stone and then at the moors beyond it, gray and still in the November air, and said, "I feel the same. I have never been able to explain it to anyone satisfactorily." She had said, "You just did." These are small moments, but small moments in the long run are what marriages are made of, and my grandmother had always known that better than any of us. My grandmother summoned me to her sitting room that afternoon. She was in her usual chair by the fire, her embroidery in her lap. She looked up when I came in, and her expression was one of complete, unruffled, triumphant serenity. "Well," she said, "I'd say your scheme has advanced satisfactorily," I said. "It is not a scheme," she said. "It is matchmaking. There is a difference. A scheme implies a trick. What I have done is simply arrange for two people who are suited to one another to be in the same room long enough to discover that fact. The rest was entirely their own doing." I sat down across from her, and the 8 heiresses are all perfectly lovely young women who will do very well elsewhere, she said, without the slightest remorse. "The Ashborough girl has her eye on the Margate heir, I believe. Miss Pemberton will catch someone in London. The Lorraine cousins are decorative and cheerful and will be fine." She looked at me with those unrepentant eyes. "I wasted no one's time, Alastair. The house party has been delightful. They have all enjoyed themselves." "Grandmothers. The question," she said, ignoring me, "is what happens next. And I believe what happens next is that your brother proposes before Christmas because your brother, whatever else he is not a man who takes 2 hours in a library with a woman who reads 60-year-old deed documents for pleasure, and then does not immediately understand that he is in love with her." I stared at her. He said that. He didn't need to say it, she said. I have known him for 34 years. I know precisely what he looks like when he understands something irreversible. She returned to her embroidery. He will propose before Christmas, and she will say yes, because she is not a foolish woman, and because she has been reading about this estate for 2 years for no practical reason at all, which is the closest a woman of her particular temperament will come to confessing that she loves it. She made a stitch. And loves him, which is the more important part, though the estate and the man are rather intertwined in her case. She was, as it developed, correct about all of it. He proposed on the 14th of December in the library, which I thought was fitting. Not with the formal architecture of a duke offering a suitable match to an appropriate young woman, but in the kind of direct and slightly unpolished sincerity of a man who has spent 6 weeks discovering that the person he wants to speak to at the beginning and end of each day has been in the same house all along. She said yes. She said it with the measured, steady warmth of a woman who has thought it through and made her decision, which was more moving, in its way, than any more dramatic acceptance could have been. My grandmother received the news with the exact degree of satisfaction she was entitled to, which was, in my estimation, a great deal. And to her credit, she expressed it only in the brief smile she allowed herself in the privacy of her sitting room, before conducting the rest of the day with an air of serene and entirely unconvincing surprise. The guests had long since departed. The house had gone back to its quieter self, its fires and its old furniture and the evening sound of the harpsichord. Except that now there were 2 voices in the library after dinner instead of 1, and the account books for the eastern boundary had been sent for by a woman who had every reason to make herself at home in them. And Dunvaren Hall had the quality it had been missing for some years, the quality of a house that expects to be lived in by people who intend to stay. I told my grandmother, on the evening before Callum and Rosalind were formally announced, that I thought she had engineered the entire business with considerably more precision than was perhaps strictly necessary. The Rose Terrace, I said, the seating arrangement, the estate account books, the boundary deed in the library at precisely the right moment. She considered this. I did not arrange the courier, she said. That was genuinely good fortune. But everything else. She looked at me steadily. Everything else, she said, was simply paying attention. I have paid attention to that young woman for 2 years, and I have paid attention to your brother for 34. I did not invent what was between them. I simply created the conditions in which they were obliged to see it. She tilted her head slightly. Is that so terrible? I thought about it. I thought about Rosalind in the gray November light on the eastern boundary path, her gloved hand gesturing toward the stone wall, her voice unhurried and exact. I thought about my brother's face in the library by lamplight, saying I was glad that someone had asked. I thought about a Tuesday evening harpsichord heard through old floors, and a man standing up from his chair with the look of a man who has decided something and a door he intends to walk through. No, I said, it's not terrible at all. She smiled, the full smile this time, not the small private one. The one she permitted herself when she was entirely right about something and no longer saw any reason to conceal it. I have been doing this for 50 years, she said with considerable satisfaction. I am very good at it. She remained so. Rosalind became the Duchess of Dunvaren in the spring, in a small ceremony at the chapel on the estate, with the tenants of the valley in the yard and Snow still on the upper moors and my grandmother in the front pew looking like a woman who has arranged the weather as well. The dean read the service. The stone walls of the chapel held the sound of the vows in that particular way of very old stone, clear and final and entirely sure of themselves. I stood at my brother's side, and I watched him look at her, at Rosalind, who had been invisible for 2 years and had chosen, for 1 fortnight, to be visible. And what was on his face was the look of a man who has found the thing he did not know he was missing, and intends, for the rest of his life, never to lose sight of it again. My grandmother, afterward, at the small celebration in the great hall, accepted a glass of champagne and toasted the health of the Duke and Duchess of Dunvaren with the unruffled air of a woman whose scheme, matchmaking, she would insist, there is a difference, had come off precisely as intended. Which it had. I have said she was the most terrifying woman in the north of England. I should add, she was also, if you were paying attention, the most generous.